We are going to continue talking about modifiers, and in particular, we're going to talk about this one called the subdivision surface modifier. So before we get to that, we're going to do some comparing and contrasting ways of doing things. So start with a cube, duplicate it, and by Shift D for duplicate, just move it along the x-axis so you have two cubes to look at. Go to the to the cube on the left and just hit Tab to go into edit mode. And we're going to right click and choose subdivide. Now we've done this before. This is a way of adding geometry. So if you click that once and then open this window at the bottom left, you can add subdivisions. So let's add 8 subdivisions. So now we've got this cube with a lot more information. If I hit Tab out of that, now the two cubes look identical. This one, so if I select them both, go to edit mode, you've got one on the left with a lot of subdivisions, one on the right with very little. And when we're looking in object mode, they look the same. Okay, so that's fine. That's what we expect. This one has detail to be modeled, this one doesn't. So let's click on the one on the right. Go to the right-hand side of your screen and make sure you have the wrench selected, which is your modifier properties. And we're going to click on Add Modifier, Subdivision Surface. Now, just take a moment to look at what's happening here. So, the default subdivision surface modifier is this thing called Catmull-Clark. And all it's doing is it is adding subdivisions just like you did before, but it's also smoothing the space in between. It's trying to basically round the sharp edges. Okay, it's taking something sharp and making it round. If you go down to the viewport option and you increase this number from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5, 6, 7, 8, you start to see what happens. It essentially, only goes to 6. It essentially makes a sphere out of a cube. Okay, so it's not just adding subdivisions, it's also smoothing. So to demonstrate how what it's doing differently than the original is actually, if you go over and you just simply click on Simple instead of Catmull-Clark, you'll see that even though we've added 4 subdivisions here, it doesn't look any different. And in fact, if you hit Tab, you see it hasn't done it. Now remember, modifiers work by giving you a preview of what they're doing, and they don't actually kind of get stuck or permanently applied to the object until you hit the Apply button. So if you hit Apply, and now you hit Tab, you'll see that basically select both objects and go into edit mode. So now you've got subdivisions being created just like they were before. So if I undo that several times till I get back to here, and if I apply the modifier now when it's in the Catmull-Clark, of course I've created an object that's very different than the first object. Oops. Okay, so undo that. Right, so that's the looking at it with a cube. Let's look at one more object and talk about how this might work in a more practical way. So I'm going to delete both of these. I'm going to create a Suzanne monkey head, and I'm going to duplicate that just like we did before. Move it along the x-axis exactly like we did before, and let's take the one on the left, go into edit mode, right click, let's subdivide this. Let's subdivide it 4 times. That's good. All right, so now now notice the difference just right offhand. This is subdivided. You are adding geometry, but it's all very sharp. Even if I go to right click and say shade smooth, there's a kind of, the ridges are sharp. And if I shade this smooth, you know, it's same thing. You still have some of the same problems, right? So I'm going to shade this flat so that we can really see the difference. All right, so we've got an object on the left that we subdivided the traditional way, smoothed it, and you still have quite a lot of, you know, it's quite blocky. If we go to the add modifier with our new Suzanne head on the right and say subdivision surface. All right, let's look. By default, Catmull Clark, and if you increase this number, let's say to 4 on the viewport, you should obviously see quite a big difference between the way these are smoothing and how they're smoothing, right? This like the look that they're given. Now, if you zoom way in, you're still going to see, you know, what the subdivisions are going to look like. But now, if you take this new one and you right-click and you also shade smooth it, now we're looking at something incredibly smooth. Okay, so one more super important thing here is that the difference between render and viewport quality you can just leave alone. Just leave it at 3. I haven't been able to see the differences. Okay, so the viewport is what you see here. This is doing 4 subdivisions, right? So if I change it to 2, it's going to look like that. Let me go back and smooth flat so you can really see it. Okay, so that's the viewport. The render is the level of subdivisions it's going to give you when you actually make a render. So let's show you the difference. Let's make the render 1 and the viewport at 4. So the way it looks in the viewport is great. Go into our camera view. Let's review something here. Hit N and go to view, locked camera view. Oops. And let's get a better, let's crop this in a better way so we can really see. Okay, so we've got this. And hit F12 to render. All right, so notice that even though in our viewport it's very smooth, when it rendered it, it only rendered 1 subdivision. So let's bump this up to 4 and render it again. And now you see that it should match, right? The amount of render here and the amount of render here. Okay, so why would there be 2 different options? So the reason is that when you add a lot of these subdivisions, let me turn this off. If you add a lot of these subdivisions, it can start to bog down your processor and your computer time, especially if you are in rendered mode and you are in cycles. So this can start to slow things down. So if you want, what you can do is you can say, okay, I know when I'm rendering it, I'm going to render it really smooth. But in order to move around more efficiently in the viewport, I'm going to bring down this just down to 1, and I'll just preview it this way, knowing that even though I'm previewing it low quality, when I hit 12 and I render it, it's going to render it very smooth. Good. All right, so you can see that's working. So last thing to mention with this before we end is, again, that let me go back into solid mode. The object is still, when I hit edit, the object is still very simple. It's low geometry, right? The only time you actually kind of make it permanent is if you hit apply, and now you have a very smooth piece of geometry, but also one that's going to be take a lot more processing power to deal with. All right, that is the end of